Okay, it's 6:30, so let's get this going. Um, I'm sure you are knee deep in the other paper for the other course, but sorry. Once again, it's important that you don't just stop working on the capstone paper because, like I keep saying, once you're behind, it's really difficult to catch up. So let me remind you with two things as you are working on your literature review. Can somebody send me a message to tell me whether you can hear me or not on the chat room? Okay, great. Thank you. Right. So don't forget two things about your literature review. First thing is that the majority of the literature of your references or your sources, however you call it, must be PA related, right? And so focus your search mostly with public administration journals and public administration books, right? And second of all, don't forget, in the literature review, you should also take the opportunity to identify the research gap. It doesn't have to be huge, or it doesn't have to be central to your research question, but there must be something that is, well, I think it's already at max, and I don't want to yell. So, where was I? Right, it's important that you identify the research gap in the literature review. And once you identify the research gap, you can maybe go back to your introduction and just add a few sentences, right, to address how your project can answer some questions in the research gap. It doesn't have to be central. It just has to be PA, public administration related. Okay. So don't forget, the literature review is due on the 20th of October, and so that's about a week and a half from now. And I am seriously concerned that some of you are behind the process. So the other thing that I want you to start thinking about is the next section. You have the introduction, and then you have the literature review. The next section is to discuss your research design. And like always, I have come up with another set of resources to try to help you to work on the section. Okay. There are some basic questions. There are some basic questions about your research project that you want to tell your readers how you are proceeding in researching this question, right? So today, I just want you to think about two major questions, two major issues in your research design. And we have some time, and so I'm gonna divide this whole thing into several smaller questions. And I have uploaded a PowerPoint so that and flowcharts so that you can gain some clarity in the project that you're working on. If you're not clear about what you're doing, it would be impossible to explain to somebody else, right? And we have done that in dealing with our research question to clarify exactly what you're doing. And that's how you're able to explain to your readers what your research question is. The same idea, if you're not clear about your research design, it would not be possible to be clear in the proposal in telling your readers how you will proceed to research this question, right? And of course, remember, we're just proposing how this research will be done. We're not actually doing it, okay? So two major questions that I want you to think about this week, and just thinking, we're not there writing yet. The first question is it qualitative or quantitative? And the second question is the research design itself. So the first big question, well, the sample paper that I posted on Canvas is clearly a qualitative research, right? And it seems like in most cases with your cohort, you're leaning towards a qualitative design. So if you look at the PowerPoint that I posted under today, the first question is it qualitative or quantitative? The major thing to think about or to imagine, because we're not really doing it, right? So the first thing to really imagine is that, okay, if I were really trying to get data to test something or to research the research question that you're working on, how would I do it? What is my data, right? And it's important that you explain to your readers what would be the intent data that you're collecting, right? So if you look at a flowchart, is it qualitative or quantitative, right? How do I collect my data? So you have this research question, right? How do I improve education performance among this population? Okay. Then you have to think about, really, how do I collect data? And we're giving you a range of options, right? And on the flowchart, I listed 4 major ways. So interviews, documents, some kind of document, or laws, legal documents. And then the second set, either a questionnaire or existing data sets. The interesting thing really is that you can do any research question with any of these choices. It's so in that case, there's no wrong answers. The main issue is that how do you justify, right? How do you justify the method that you're proposing? So interviews, it's pretty straightforward, right? And later on, I'll give you more resource to think about who are the interviewees. If you want to interview people to get information on your research question, who would be the appropriate interviewees? Why are they relevant? Why are they the right people to talk to, right? And that's why early on, I asked you to think about the idea of stakeholders, right? Or key informants. Those are terms that we use in research. Key informants. For instance, if what I was talking about earlier, for instance, I'm interested in researching a process that would improve the education outcome. Who should I talk to about that? Should I talk to the students? Should I talk to the parents? Or should I talk to school officials? Should I talk to teachers? Who should I talk to, right? Who would be the key informants? Or administrators? Who would be the most appropriate informants in that case? And for the capstone process, and we're not really doing it. So in that case, you don't have to worry about access, right? If you really have to do it, then you really have to think about how to access those people. And that would give you, trust me, it would be much more difficult and a whole bunch of headaches when you have to think about access. But for now, we're just identifying. And the task in that case is to convince your readers why they are the right people to talk to, right? The key informants. Why are they the stakeholders, right? So that's interview. And in that case, you are collecting or you are using a qualitative method, right? Because qualitative means no numbers. You're not using numbers to measure anything. Remember 620, right? A big part of it is to develop a questionnaire. A questionnaire, and in so many cases, the questions are in Likert scale and in matrices, remember? So when you use some kind of a numeric value from 1 to 7, right? How satisfied is your work life from 1 to 7? In that case, you are using that number to measure something, right? And that would make it a quantitative study. But in this case, we're just interviewing, or you are proposing just interviewing without converting what they are telling you into numbers. And so that would be a qualitative study. The second box in the middle column, document laws. Only a couple of you are analyzing legal documents or policies. In that case, yes, it would also be understood as a qualitative study. Again, no numbers are involved. How many documents? That's not exactly, but it's referring to the data. Is it being converted into a numeric scale? All right. Anytime you don't do that, then it's a qualitative study. But some of you, your topics, if you are interested, you can argue that a quantitative approach is more appropriate. For instance, if you want to get answers from a lot of people, right? Remember the whole sample thing, right? If you want to get information from a lot of cases or a lot of individuals, then you might want to consider a quantitative approach, more specifically using questionnaire. And once again, we're not really writing the questionnaire, but we're just saying in that case, you know, depending on the topic or the question itself, if your question would be better answered with a lot of cases, in other words, a lot of getting the information from a lot of people, then that quantitative study by using questionnaire would be a better strategy, right? And once again, it's a quantitative method because, like the Likert scale, the matrices that we work on, most of the questions are converted into a numeric answer, a number, right? How satisfied are you? 1 being absolutely miserable and angry, and 7 euphoric. And I answered, well, I feel, yeah, it's quite good, but you know, I'm not overly excited about it. So I answer 5. So in that case, it's being converted or quantified into a number, and you get 1,000 cases, and then you get 1,000 answers, all in numbers. That's the definition of quantification. So in that case, if you believe your your research question would be better addressed with a lot of answers from a lot of people, a questionnaire would be a better option. And the minimum number would be at least 100 cases, right? But that's later on. The fourth option is using an existing data set. And I think I don't remember seeing any proposal using existing data sets, right? Because you have to, well, for the purpose of a research proposal, you actually have to have the data set identified in front of you so that you understand the source, the data collection process of the existing data set. And you have to understand how that is either appropriate or problematic and so on and so forth. So in most cases, I discourage using existing data set unless you know the data set very well, okay? But in that case, if you're using existing data, then of course it would be quantitative research. So the next page, right? Quantitative versus qualitative. Well, so in that case, ask yourself this question: am I collecting a lot of cases? Do I want answers from a lot of people? Why would that be appropriate, or why would that be practical, right? If you don't need a lot of answers from a lot of cases, then there's nothing wrong with using interviews and be very, very focused with, proposing 10, 15 interviews. That's perfectly all right. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, okay? But somehow if you believe, especially from the user side, if you want to collect data on either the customers or some kind of service receiver side, right? Then yes, you can still argue interview as the appropriate method, in that case a qualitative study. But at the same time, you can also argue that you need a lot of cases, especially with large programs, right? So in that case, you can argue questionnaire and a quantitative approach is what you want to do. Again, you don't actually have to do it, right? It's not like we ask you to perform statistical analysis and then interpret the data and then make conclusions. We're not doing that. So it's not as intimidating as some of you, So think about it. How many cases, right, do you need in your data collection? If few cases, then you can think about qualitative. And then if a lot of cases, a large sample, as a matter of fact, then you can argue quantitative, okay? One more time, there's no wrong answer. But there is match, right? Mismatch or good match between the research question and the quantitative or qualitative nature of the study, okay? So think about that. Right, so next page, quantitative versus qualitative. It's just a reiteration of what I talked about. Quantitative, the data are numeric and can be summarized numerically, right? So in that case, once again, think about 620. Think about the Likert scale questions 1 to 7, and think about the matrices that we worked on. That's what we are referring. And then quantitative, once again, if you want to collect data from many cases or many individuals and many variables, if you want to ask a lot of questions, then that are measured in a predetermined way, right? Only 1 to 7. Then you might want to suggest quantitative. But for most cases in this cohort, it seems like qualitative would be a better way to go. So once again, qualitative refers to typically obtain more in-depth, detailed information on fewer cases, like an interview, right? You talk to somebody for about an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, and then you can ask very small questions. Now, for the capstone project, you don't have to come up with the interview schedule to tell us all the questions. But at the very least, you want to point to the major questions that you will ask in answering your research question. And we'll talk about that in the next part of the research talk or research methods talk. But so many of those questions would be informed by your literature review, right? That tells you, that guides you what questions that you're going to ask in answering your research question, right? So the first thing to do is to figure out whether you are doing qualitative or quantitative, okay? And then the second part is a little trickier to most students, and that's why I came up with a flow chart. So there are several types of research design. Exploratory, and you have heard these terms, right? And I've seen these terms in your topic proposals, but some of them pretty clear to me that in some cases they are not necessarily properly understood. Okay, so you have several types of research: explanatory, descriptive, causal, and evaluation. So think about the look at the end towards the right-hand side of the slide. You have four major types of research design. You can call it exploratory, or descriptive, or causal, not casual, causal. And then lastly, evaluation research. So the thinking process, I want you to look at the slide and go from the very left-hand side, right? Am I evaluating an existing program or policy? Now, if your study involves a program or policy, it doesn't necessarily mean it's an evaluation research, okay? I say it again. Even if you are even if your research question involves a program or a policy or a practice, doesn't necessarily mean it's evaluation research, because an evaluation research is much more specific, right? So think about that, because there are additional issues that you have to think about in an evaluation research. I'll talk about it in the next page. Evaluating, is it doing a good job? But according to what criteria? Now that's the tricky part about evaluation research, right? You have to make sure that you understand the criteria in evaluating, not just saying good, bad, not just saying working, not working, right? But according to what standards, according to what criteria are you saying is working, is not working? So that's the tricky part about evaluation research. And if your research question deals with a policy, but you don't want to push it that far, it's perfectly all right to not call it an evaluation research. And I'll talk about it more in the next page. So the first question to ask, am I evaluating an existing, okay? Something is already out there that you might address. And that's one of the things I kept pushing for in the process is to come up with a research question. Am I evaluating an existing program or policy? If you say yes, then it will be, or you should describe your research as an evaluation research. And like I said, next page, we'll look at what an evaluation research is about. But if you don't want to evaluate an existing if you don't want to evaluate an existing policy or program or practice, then okay, no. And it's perfectly fine. We'll just have to figure out what it is. So from no, the second box, right? Am I testing a hypothesis? And you don't have to, right? There's no one that says you must develop hypotheses to test. but some of you clearly are moving into that direction. Okay, and so if you have developed hypotheses, okay, and hypotheses are directly testable, so it's kind of tricky. And for those of you who haven't really thought about what your hypotheses are, I would suggest don't go that way, because writing a hypothesis, a specific hypothesis directly testable, involves additional decision making and additional understanding of the process itself. But in some cases, in your cohort, you are testing hypotheses. Okay? You already have decided on a theoretical framework, and you have identified hypotheses that you want to test in your research. Then, yes, if you are testing hypotheses, yes, then your research is more in causal, right? It's a causal design, because you are testing a hypothesis in identifying and explaining causal relationships. Okay. If you're not testing hypotheses, which is fine, right? In most cases, you haven't really thought about hypotheses, then I would suggest don't go there, because it just complicates things a little bit more. So if you're not testing hypotheses, then the next question to ask is that, what do we know about the question, right? What do we know about the topic, and what do we know about the question? In other words, the research gap, right? Are there many existing studies on the research topic? Is there a whole library of books and articles on the topic that you're discussing? And in most cases, yeah. In most cases, there's quite a few. There's quite a bit of existing research already, published on the topic itself, right? So if there is a lot, some to quite a bit, if there's quite a bit existing research, meaning it's not that difficult to find articles in similar topics. It doesn't. Remember, it doesn't have to be exactly your topic or research question, but there's enough existing stuff in the general topic itself. Then you want to call it a descriptive research, okay? A descriptive research, meaning it's not causal yet because you are not testing hypotheses. So you're just describing, right? You're just describing what it is in your research question, and then leave it to some other people, maybe, to develop causal designs, and that's perfectly all right. There's nothing wrong with it. If there's not much that has been done on your topic or research question, then guess what? It would be exploratory, right? Explore, because we don't know much about it. So this flow chart hopefully makes it easier for you to identify what kind of research that your research question would fall under, right? Next step, next page. Again, it's just reiteration, but and for the most part, the choice itself, right? There's no wrong answer, but how well you understand the choice that you have made and justify that choice. Now that's where the work comes in, right? But at the very least, I think this week you should think about one of the four choices, whether it is an evaluation research, exploratory research, descriptive research, or causal research. And once again, evaluation research, the tricky thing is that you have to show clearly the criteria to evaluate the program or policy or the practice. And most of the time you can find it in the mission statement or in some other description of the program itself. And in that case, the measurements and the instrument, even though we don't have to actually develop the measurements or the instrument, but when you discuss the measurements or the instrument, you will have to make sure that the measurements and the instruments are based on the institutional goals or mission statements or whatever that you use to evaluate the program or the policy, right? So that's why it requires a much higher degree of understanding of the program or the policy or the practice that you're trying to address. And if you don't know everything about the program or the policy or the practice that you're trying to address in a research question, I would suggest you don't call the research and evaluation research, right? Because it's just going to cause a lot more confusion on your part, and that would make it more difficult. So under evaluation research, it's defined as a class of research to determine an impact of a social intervention. So that policy or the program or the practice that I just mentioned, those would be to measure the outcome, right? Measurable outcome. And you hear these terms, thrown around quite a bit: evidence-based practice and measurable outcomes, and so on and so forth. All those are coming out of that evaluation research practice. And unless you are very, very clear about the program or the practice that you're trying to study, then evaluation research would be quite or more demanding than other types of research designs. Okay. So you have the under evaluation research is the goal is to assess, right? Evaluation, assessment, to assess specific specific outcomes according to the goals of program or practice. So if you're not clear, or if you don't want to spend that much time in studying the program, then it's best not to go that route. And like I said, the most important part of an evaluation research is the measurements and the instrument, the research instrument itself, and to justify why the measurements and the instruments would be appropriate or effective in the evaluation, right? And so, like I said, it's more demanding in that case. And the second item, exploratory research. Exploratory research, it's appropriate when there are few or no earlier studies, when there's virtually nothing known about the topic, right? So now we are talking about the topic, not so much the research question itself, right? If nothing is known about the topic, then you might, then the most appropriate thing to do is to frame it as an exploratory research, right? So few or no earlier studies to refer to or rely upon to predict an outcome. That would be the definition of an exploratory research. And for most projects in this course, in this cohort, I think descriptive research would be most suited for the purpose, right? So descriptive, it's about the who, what, when, where, and how. Not the why, but how, associated with a particular research problem, okay? So it's not definitively addressing the causal relationships. Already identified hypotheses in your study. If you have a theoretical framework, and if you want to test the theoretical framework, and if you have already developed hypotheses, then it would be a causal research design. A causal research design is to measure what impact a specific change will have on existing norms and assumptions, right? Based on hypotheses. I wanted you to think causally in developing the research question, but that doesn't necessarily that does not necessarily mean that your project has to be causal research design, because I think most people think better in thinking in causal relationships, but testing it is a totally different topic, right? So even that with that exercise, we worked on X to Y and blah, 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 blah. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a causal research design, right? So under causal research, measure what impact a specific change will have on existing norms and assumptions. And particularly, that involves causal explanations that reflect the test of hypotheses. Right? Somebody's mic. Could somebody turn off the mic? Right. So unless you know how to develop hypotheses, or unless you have already developed hypotheses, then I would suggest not go that far in calling it causal research. Right? And for the most part, your research will be theoretically driven, meaning you know which theory, which conceptual framework you are testing. And for the most part, we are not doing that. Right? You can reference some theories in your literature review, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually testing those theories, right? So for the most part, as a rule of thumb, causal research are theoretically driven. And the question is to explain why, right? And for the most part, descriptive research goes as far as how, but not the why, because the why requires much more than, much more explanatory, much more explaining in making the case and supporting your conclusion. So hopefully this little PowerPoint, especially the flowchart, helps you to identify the research proposal that you're working on. Right? For now, just think about it and at least have some impression of whether it's qualitative or quantitative, and then whether it is explanatory, whether it is exploratory, descriptive, causal, or evaluation research. And once again, qualitative and quantitative, and then the 4 types of research, they are 2 different questions. Okay, don't confuse them. All right. So you could do a quantitative but exploratory research, or you can do a qualitative but evaluation research, which is kind of rare, but it still happens. Okay. So hopefully this one, helps in making the process less intimidating, and yeah. Any questions?
And next week, I'll probably come up with another worksheet to help you start on your data and method section. Right? There's still a week and a half between now and the due date of the literature review. So well, coming up, okay, the question is, on the literature review, any special tips on coming up with themes and trends? Well, when you see several articles addressing the same broad topic, then that's one theme there, right? Or maybe they are using specific theoretical frameworks in addressing the same topic, then it's another theme there, right? So look for commonalities. Look for similarities and commonalities, and look at the exchange in their literature review, and also in the outcome section. They are answering one another. A lot of research articles, they are addressing one another, answering one another in the debate, and that's where you find the major themes and trends, right? And also sometimes they use different keywords, right? So those are the few things in identifying themes and trends. And also, if you look at a specific topic, then there are sections, for instance, in textbooks that would explain differences in different perspectives. And that's another way in finding themes and trends, right? What else? Look at their literature review. Look at how different articles are grouped together in different paragraphs. Their literature review, right? And make sure that you keep organized when you see citations in their literature review. Look up those citations, and let's see why they are grouped under one single category, and how these different paragraphs, first of all, address one another, and then go from there. What else? I know I'm being repetitive, but 15%, 15%, 15%, right? Paraphrase, paraphrase, paraphrase. Switch around the order of words. Replace different words with similar. Use the thesaurus. Use the thesaurus, and then use the worksheets that I have posted on Canvas. All right. What else? And one more time, don't forget the majority, not necessarily all, but the majority of your sources must be from public administration, journals or papers, or journals, or books, or reports, right? And then it's very, very important towards the end of the literature review to identify the research gap, right? Because later on, you'll have to address how your research fills the research gap. It doesn't have to be a major thing, okay? It doesn't have to be a groundbreaking idea, because, well, we're not even doing the research. We're just identifying the research gap, right? But make sure that you spend some time thinking about it, and to clearly explain the research gap. And because next stage of the process will have to fit your project into the research gap. Okay? What else? Okay. So, like always, work on, if you have time to work on your revisions, right? Make sure everything, it's, when you look at your, when you're done with your revisions, make sure you upload your revisions to turn it in, what is that link? All revisions, turn it in and check the match rate, right? It's very important that you keep every section under 15% because, you know, the whole thing, the end product has to be under 15%. But so if you do it section by section, it will be a lot easier towards the end instead of towards the end, all of a sudden go like, what? Holy what? So yeah, definitely work on that. Anything else? No? Okay, in that case, I'll stop the recording here. And yeah, let me know if there are any questions, okay? All right, good luck with the other paper. And then, yeah, all right.